Snow was falling on Naboo, not the gentle flurries that sometimes grace the planet's temperate zones, but heavy, thick snowflakes that blanketed the capital city of Theed in a way the locals hadn't seen in generations. Each flake was unique, a crystalline masterpiece formed in the upper atmosphere, drifting down through layers of air that grew progressively warmer until these frozen travelers kissed the stone streets and ornate buildings of the capital. The winter festival was approaching, that special time when families across the galaxy celebrated the turning of the year, when light triumphed over the longest darkness, when hope rekindled even in the coldest hearts. The festival had roots stretching back thousands of years, predating even the formation of the Galactic Republic. Different cultures celebrated it in different ways. On Coruscant, they illuminated the Senate building with 1 billion lights, turning the massive structure into a beacon visible from orbit. On Kashyyyk, the Wookiees climbed to the highest branches of their Rasha trees and sang songs that resonated through the forests for days. On Tatooine, where snow was a concept rather than reality, moisture farmers would gather under the twin suns and share precious water, symbolizing abundance and community even in scarcity. Here on Naboo, the tradition involved decorating homes and public spaces with handcrafted ornaments, preparing elaborate feasts that brought extended families together, and most importantly, lighting ceremonial candles at midnight on the longest night. These candles represented the persistent light of civilization, the warmth of community, the endurance of hope against overwhelming darkness. Children were told that if they watched the candles carefully, if they believed strongly enough, they might glimpse something extraordinary, the Force itself manifest in invisible form, blessing those who maintained faith during the difficult times. Young Kyle Vries pressed his face against the frost-covered window of his family's modest apartment in Theed's outer districts. At 11 years old, he was caught in that awkward space between childhood wonder and adolescent skepticism, that delicate age when magic begins to seem implausible and the universe reveals itself as governed by physics rather than miracles. His breath fogged the transparent steel as he watched snowflakes dance in the glow of the street lamps below, each one unique, each one temporary, melting the moment it touched something warmer than itself. The apartment where Kyle lived with his family occupied the third floor of a building that had stood for 2 centuries, its stone facade weathered by time and elements, but still beautiful in the characteristic Naboo style. Arched windows looked out over narrow streets that wound through the older sections of Theed, far from the opulent palaces and government buildings that tourists flocked to see. This was where ordinary citizens lived, where mechanics and teachers and merchants raised their families in comfortable obscurity, content with their modest lives. Kale's family had lived in Theed for 3 generations. His grandfather had been a pilot in the Royal Security Forces, flying N-1 starfighters in defense of Naboo during various small conflicts that occasionally troubled a peaceful world. His grandmother had been a teacher at one of the city's public schools, spending 40 years educating children in mathematics and basic science. They were gone now, both of them, but their presence still permeated the apartment in subtle ways. The furniture they'd chosen, the artwork on the walls, the heavy wooden table where the family gathered for meals, its surface marked with decades of use, scarred by hot pots and scratched by utensils, but solid and enduring. Cale's father, Torvin, had followed a different path than his pilot father. He joined the Republic merchant fleet as a young man, seeing dozens of worlds during his 10 years of service. He'd hauled cargo from the core worlds to the outer rim and back, witnessed the incredible diversity of life the galaxy contained, and eventually returned to Naboo with stories that filled Cale's childhood with wonder. But merchant fleet life was hard, demanding, and poorly compensated. When Torvin met Lyra, a local girl working in her family's textile shop, he'd made the choice to settle down, to trade adventure for stability and the unknown for the known. Now Torvin operated a small repair shop in the lower levels of their building, fixing household appliances and navigation computers for neighbors who couldn't afford the official service centers. It was honest work, but barely provided enough to support the family. Lyra supplemented their income by taking in sewing, creating elaborate garments for Theed's wealthier citizens who wanted custom work. Between them, Cale's parents managed to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. But there was never anything extra, never room for luxuries or unexpected expenses. Cale understood their struggles even though they tried to hide them from him and Mira. He'd overheard late-night conversations about mounting debt, about whether they could afford to keep the apartment or would need to move to an even cheaper district. He'd seen his mother's hands, cramped and calloused from endless hours working fabric, her fingers moving with mechanical precision through tasks that brought her no joy. He'd watched his father's shoulders bow under the weight of responsibility, saw how each passing year added new lines to his face, new gray to his hair. This was the reality Cale knew, not the glamorous, exciting galaxy promised by holodramas and adventure stories, but the grinding, difficult existence of ordinary people trying to survive in a universe that cared nothing for their struggles. And increasingly, Cale found himself wondering if there was any point to it all, any meaning beyond the daily grind of work and worry, any larger purpose that made the suffering worthwhile. Behind him, his younger sister Mira was arranging handmade decorations around their small dwelling, paper stars cut from old datapad printouts, strings of lights salvaged from broken equipment at their father's repair shop, and in the corner, a small synthetic tree their mother had purchased from the market. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and Mira treated each ornament like it was crafted from pure rhodium. "Cale, come help me hang the star," Mira called, her voice bright with that unshakable enthusiasm only 8-year-olds could maintain. "I can't reach the top." Cale turned from the window, a slight frown creasing his features. "It's just a decoration, Mira. It doesn't mean anything." His sister's face fell, and immediately Cale regretted his words. But lately, he couldn't help himself. Everything felt hollow, empty of the meaning adults insisted was there. The force that the old story spoke of, the mystical energy field that supposedly connected all living things that gave the Jedi their legendary powers. Cale had never felt it, not once. And if the force was real, if it truly bound the galaxy together, shouldn't he be able to sense something? Anything? Their mother, Lyra, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of warm Nuna cakes, their spiced aroma filling the apartment. She was a kind woman with patient eyes that had seen too much hardship but refused to let it extinguish her gentleness. "Cale, help your sister, please." With a sigh, Kyle crossed the room and lifted Mira onto his shoulders. She giggled as she placed the star atop the tree, a simple thing made of twisted wire and reflective foil. But in the soft light, it sparkled like a real star might, like the stars he'd watched through his window on clearer nights, wondering if anyone out there among them knew the truth about the Force, about the Jedi, about whether any of it mattered. "There," Mira announced proudly. "Now it's perfect." Their father, Torvin, looked up from the Holonews terminal where he'd been reading about increased separatist activity in the Outer Rim. The Clone Wars were still years away, but tensions were building, and men like Torvin, who'd served in the Republic's merchant fleet, knew how to read the signs. "It looks wonderful, little star," he said to Mira, then glanced at Kyle with an expression that mixed concern and understanding. "You know, when I was your age, I didn't believe in much either. The galaxy seemed too big, too complicated, too full of suffering for there to be any real meaning to it." Kale set Mira down and shoved his hands in his pockets. "So, what changed?" Torvin smiled, but it was a sad smile, weighted with experience. "I grew up, and I realized that meaning isn't something you find out there in the stars. It's something you create right here with the people you love. The Force, if it exists, isn't some distant power wielded only by Jedi Knights in ancient temples. It's in every choice we make to be kind when we could be cruel, to hope when despair seems easier, to believe in something larger than ourselves even when we can't prove it's real." The words were meant to comfort, Kale knew, but they only deepened the restlessness in his chest. He'd heard these platitudes before. They were what adults said when they didn't have real answers, when they wanted you to stop asking difficult questions and just accept things as they were. Later that evening, after Mira had been tucked into bed and his parents had retired to their room, Kale lay on his sleeping mat, staring at the ceiling. The snow continued to fall outside, heavier now, accumulating on windowsills and rooftops, transforming Theed into something from a storybook. The kind of storybook that promised magic and wonder and heroes who could move objects with their minds and see the future and bring hope to the hopeless. But those were just stories, weren't they? Kyle had read everything he could find about the Jedi Order in the public archives. The ancient texts spoke of the Force as an energy field created by all living things, surrounding them, penetrating them, binding the galaxy together. They described Jedi who could sense emotions across vast distances, who could influence the weak-minded with mere suggestions, who could leap impossible heights and deflect blaster bolts with weapons made of pure light. It all sounded incredible, literally incredible, as in not credible, not believable. And yet sometimes, in quiet moments, Kale thought he felt something, a whisper at the edge of perception, like the echo of a song he'd never heard but somehow knew all the words to. When Mira had fallen from the balcony last summer, he'd known before he'd seen it, had been running toward her, before her scream even reached his ears. When his mother was sad, even when she smiled and pretended everything was fine, he could feel the weight of her sorrow pressing against his chest like a physical thing. Were those just coincidences? Enhanced intuition? Or was there something more? Something he was afraid to acknowledge because acknowledging it would mean accepting that the galaxy was far stranger and more wonderful and more terrifying than the simple, mundane reality he'd built for himself. The clock on the wall chimed midnight. Outside, the snow fell in absolute silence, that peculiar quiet that comes when the world is blanketed in white, when sound itself seems muffled and distant. Kyle pulled his covers tighter and closed his eyes, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. That's when he heard it. A sound unlike anything he'd experienced before, low and resonant, like the hum of a massive engine, but smoother, almost musical. It vibrated through the walls of the apartment, through the bed beneath him, through his bones themselves. Kyle sat up, heart pounding, and turned toward the window. The snow had stopped falling. The entire street was illuminated by a pale blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Kyle scrambled to the window and looked down. There, hovering silently above the street, was a ship. But not just any ship. This vessel was unlike the sleek Republic cruisers or the boxy cargo haulers that frequented Naboo's spaceports. It was ancient, its hull plated in what looked like tarnished silver that caught the streetlights and reflected them in rippling patterns. The design was elegant, almost organic, with sweeping curves and elaborate filigree etched into every surface. Symbols Cale didn't recognize covered the hull, glowing faintly with that same pale blue luminescence. The ship was perhaps 50 meters long, shaped vaguely like an elongated teardrop, with viewing ports along its sides that emanated warm golden light. A boarding ramp had extended from its underside, touching the snow-covered street with barely a whisper, and standing at the base of that ramp, looking directly up at Cale's window, was a figure in flowing robes. Cale's breath caught. Even from this distance, even through the frost-touched window, he could see the figure clearly. Tall and slender, wearing robes of deep blue trimmed with silver thread that matched the ship's hull. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but Cale could see the faint outline of features, could feel eyes upon him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. The figure raised one hand in a gesture that was unmistakably an invitation. Cale's rational mind screamed warnings. Strange ship, unknown person, middle of the night. Everything about this was wrong, dangerous, the kind of situation his parents had warned him about countless times. He should wake them, should call security, should do anything except what every instinct in his body was suddenly urging him to do. He should go. The thought wasn't his own, or rather it was his own, but it came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from that place where the whispers lived, where the knowing without knowing resided. This was important. This was meant to be. This was the answer to questions he'd been asking without words for as long as he could remember. Cale dressed quickly, pulling on warm clothes and his winter coat. He moved through the apartment like a ghost, careful not to wake his family. At the door, he paused, hand on the latch, giving himself one last chance to be sensible, to be safe, to stay in the warm, known world of his ordinary life. Then he opened the door and stepped into the snow. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and clean, filling his lungs with air that tasted of ice and something else, something he couldn't name, but recognized nonetheless. His boots crunched through fresh powder as he made his way down the stairs from their apartment to street level. With each step, his heart beat faster, but it wasn't fear exactly. It was anticipation, electric and thrilling, the feeling of standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. The figure at the base of the ramp hadn't moved, hadn't shifted position even slightly. As Cale approached, details became clearer. The robes were indeed deep blue, the color of the sky just before full dark, and the silver threading wasn't just decoration but symbols, words in a language Cale didn't know, but that seemed to shimmer with meaning, just beyond his comprehension. "Hello, young one," the figure said, and the voice was warm and ageless, neither male nor female, but something beyond such simple categories. "We've been waiting for you." Cale stopped a few meters away, suddenly aware of how small he was, how young, how unprepared for whatever this moment represented. "Who are you?" The figure lowered their hood, revealing a face that confirmed Cale's suspicion that simple categories didn't apply. The features were humanoid, but refined to an almost ethereal degree, with skin that held a faint luminescence and eyes that were pools of deep amber flecked with gold. Hair the color of starlight fell in intricate braids decorated with tiny crystals that chimed softly with each movement. "I am called Varen," the figure said. "I am the conductor of this vessel, and I have come to offer you passage on a very special journey." "Where?" Cale asked, finding his voice, though it came out smaller than he'd intended. Varen's smile was gentle, understanding. "To a place that exists between myth and reality, between what you think you know and what you've always suspected might be true. To the temple of eternal winter, where the force itself gathers during the longest night of the year, where those who seek understanding can find answers to questions they didn't know how to ask." Cale's skepticism warred with the strange pull he felt toward the ship, toward this mysterious being, toward the promise of something extraordinary. "The force isn't real," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Varen gestured to the ship behind them. "This vessel was built 4,000 years ago by Jedi artisans who wove the Force into every rivet and weld. It has sailed the currents of hyperspace for millennia, appearing only once each year, only to those who stand at the threshold between belief and doubt. You feel it, don't you? That pull, that certainty that something greater than yourself is calling." Cale wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. He did feel it, had felt it his entire life without knowing what it was. This sense that reality was larger and stranger than what his eyes could see, that there were forces at work beyond the purely physical, that meaning and purpose and something resembling magic existed if only he knew where to look. "I don't understand," he admitted. "Understanding comes through experience, not explanation," Varen said. "The choice is yours, Cale Vries. Board this ship and journey with us to the Temple of Eternal Winter, or return to your warm bed and your safe, ordinary life. But choose now, for we cannot linger. The currents of the Force wait for no one." How did this being know his name? Cale hadn't introduced himself, but somehow that detail seemed less important than the fundamental choice before him. Stay or go, doubt or believe, continue as he was or step into the unknown and let it change him. Behind him, the apartment building where his family slept stood solid, real, a monument to the life he knew. Before him, the ancient ship hummed with energy that made his teeth ache and his skin tingle, promising answers and mysteries in equal measure. Cale took a step forward, then another. Then he was walking up the ramp, leaving footprints in the snow that would be covered by morning, erased as if he'd never stood there at all. The interior of the ship was breathtaking. The corridor beyond the ramp opened into a passenger compartment that defied the vessel's external dimensions. It was vast, far larger than should have been possible, with a vaulted ceiling that seemed to ripple with captured starlight. Seats lined both sides, each one crafted from some dark wood that gleamed with an inner warmth, upholstered in fabric that shifted colors as Cale looked at it, flowing from deep blue to purple to crimson and back again. But what truly caught his attention were the other passengers, children, perhaps 24 of them, ranging in age from very young to adolescent, each one sitting or standing in various states of wonder and nervousness. They came from different worlds, Cale could tell immediately. A Twi'lek girl with pale green skin and a nervous Leku that twitched with every emotion. A human boy with a dark complexion and ritual scars of the Echani warrior culture, his posture suggesting martial training despite his youth. A small Rhodian child clutching what looked like a handmade stuffed toy, its large eyes darting around a compartment with barely contained anxiety. A Myrialian girl with geometric tattoos covering her face, sitting with perfect stillness that suggested deep meditation. A human girl in expensive clothes that marked her as nobility, probably from one of the core worlds. Others he couldn't immediately identify, species he'd only seen in holodocs or read about in educational materials, all of them wearing the same expression Cale suspected was on his own face, a mixture of awe and uncertainty and barely contained excitement. The diversity of the group was extraordinary, not just in species, but in apparent socioeconomic background. Some children wore clothes that screamed wealth and privilege, garments crafted from expensive fabrics with elaborate designs. Others were dressed more like Cale himself, in practical, well-worn clothing that had been mended multiple times and would be worn until it literally fell apart. A few looked like they'd come from genuine poverty, their clothes patched and frayed, their faces bearing a gaunt look of chronic hunger. But despite these obvious differences in background and circumstances, they all shared one fundamental quality. Each of them had been touched by the Force. Each of them had experienced something that set them apart from ordinary children, that made them question the nature of reality, that suggested the galaxy contained mysteries beyond conventional understanding. "Welcome aboard," Varen said from behind him. "Please, find a seat. We'll be departing momentarily." Cale moved down the aisle, acutely aware of the eyes following him. He chose a seat near the middle of the compartment, next to a viewing port that showed the snow-covered street outside. As he settled into the seat, he was struck by how comfortable it was, how it seemed to adjust to his body, supporting him in ways he hadn't known he needed supporting. The Twi'lek girl across the aisle leaned toward him. "Did you think this was real?" she asked in accented basic. "When you first saw the ship?" Cale shook his head. "I thought I was dreaming. I'm still not convinced I'm not." "I know what you mean," she said, offering a shy smile. "I'm Neela, from Ryloth." "Cale, from right here on Naboo." He paused, then asked the question that was burning in his mind. "Do you know where we're going?" "The conductor said something about a temple, a place where the Force gathers." Neela's Leku twitched with nervousness. "My parents don't believe in the Force. They say it's superstition, stories the Jedi tell to maintain their power. But I've always felt like there was something more, like there's this energy running through everything, connect in us, and if I could just learn to touch it. I know exactly what you mean, Kyle said, and realized he was telling the truth. For the first time in his life, he was speaking with someone who understood, who shared this strange sense of otherness, of being slightly out of step with the ordinary world. Around them, other children were having similar conversations, quiet exchanges of wonder and relief and tentative hope. The Achani boy was showing a group the bruise on his arm where he'd apparently deflected a falling tool without touching it, insisting it had moved on its own at his thought. The Rhodian child was demonstrating how they could sometimes sense their parents' emotions even when separated by walls and distance. These were force sensitives, Kyle realized, all of them. Children who'd been touched by the force in small ways, who'd experienced hints of its power without understanding what it was. Children who'd been called to this ship, to this journey, for reasons that were becoming clearer with each passing moment. Varen moved to the front of the compartment, and immediately all conversation ceased. The conductor didn't raise their voice or call for attention, but somehow their presence commanded it, drew it naturally like gravity pulled objects toward a planet's surface. "You have each been chosen," Varen said, their voice carrying easily through the space despite its softness. "Not by me, not by any individual, but by the Force itself. You stand at a crossroads in your young lives, a moment when the path you choose will determine not just your future, but the future of countless others whose lives will intersect with yours in ways you cannot yet imagine." The ship shuddered slightly, and Kale realized with a start that they were moving. He pressed his face to the viewing port and watched as the street fell away below them, as Theed spread out like a map of lights and shadows, as Naboo itself became a sphere of blue and green hanging in the darkness of space. "We travel now to a place that exists outside normal space," Varen continued, "a convergence point where the Force flows like water, where the barriers between the physical and the spiritual grow thin, where those who seek truth can find it if they have the courage to look. The Temple of Eternal Winter sits upon an ice moon in a system known only to those who serve the Force's will. There you will each be tested, not by me, but by yourself, by your own fears and doubts and hopes. Some of you will find what you seek, others will find what you need. They are not always the same thing." Kyle felt his heart hammering. This was real, impossibly, incredibly, terrifyingly real. He was in a ship with dozens of other Force-sensitive children, leaving his home planet behind, traveling to some mythical temple to be tested by the Force itself. The rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible, but that part was growing quieter, drowned out by the certainty that radiated from somewhere deep in his chest, the place where the whispers lived, where the knowing resided. "The journey will take several hours," Varen said. "I suggest you rest, speak with your fellow travelers, prepare yourselves. When we arrive, everything will change. The question each of you must answer is whether you're ready for that change, whether you're willing to let go of who you thought you were and become who you're meant to be." With that, the conductor withdrew to the front of the compartment, leaving the children to their thoughts and conversations. Slowly, the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a buzz of excited chatter. Children moved between seats, introducing themselves, sharing stories of the strange experiences that had led them to board this ship. Kale found himself in conversation with a young Myrialian girl named Senna, who claimed she could sometimes see events before they happened, though never clearly enough to be useful. "It's like looking through frosted glass," she explained, her geometric facial tattoos shifting as she spoke. "I see shapes, colors, feelings, but never details. My teachers thought I was making it up trying to get attention, but I knew it was real. I knew." "Do you think that's what the Force is?" Kyle asked. "Seeing the future?" Santa shook her head. "I think it's everything. The future, the past, the present, all woven together. I think it's what connects us to each other, to the galaxy, to something bigger than ourselves. And I think we've only just started to understand what we're capable of." As they spoke, Kyle became aware of a sensation he'd never experienced before. It was like being in a crowded room, but instead of hearing voices, he was feeling emotions. Not invasively, not overwhelming, but present, like background music in a cantina. He could sense Nyla's nervousness mixed with excitement, could feel Senna's fierce determination, could detect the Achani boy's pride and the Rhodian child's fear. He could feel the Force. The realization hit him like a physical blow. All his life, he'd been sensing it without recognizing what it was. Every intuition, every moment of inexplicable knowing, every time he'd felt connected to something larger than himself, it had been the Force. And now, surrounded by others who shared his gift, in a ship that was itself infused with Force energy, the sensation was amplified 1,000-fold. Tears pricked his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. Senna reached across and squeezed his hand, understanding without words what he was experiencing. Around them, other children were having similar moments of recognition and release, years of doubt and isolation falling away like old skin being shed. The ship sailed through hyperspace, that dimension beyond dimensions where time and space bent according to rules that defied conventional physics. Through the viewing ports, Kale watched reality twist and flow, saw colors that had no names and shapes that hurt to look at directly, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Hours passed, though time felt malleable here, elastic. Some children slept, curled in their seats with the trust only the young could maintain. Others stayed awake, talking in hushed voices about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Kyle learned about worlds he'd never visited, cultures he'd never imagined, experiences both tragic and triumphant. The Achani boy, whose name was Joran, had lost his entire family in a pirate raid. He'd survived only because he'd somehow made himself unseeable, a trick he couldn't replicate but knew had saved his life. The Rhodian child, Biko, came from a family of merchants who considered Force sensitivity a genetic defect, something to be hidden and denied. A human girl named Cassia from Alderaan spoke of sensing the plants in her family's garden, feeling their slow, patient contentment in a way that both comforted and isolated her. Each story was different. Each story was the same. They were all searching for something they couldn't name, for validation of experiences that set them apart, for understanding of abilities that defied explanation. The Achani boy, Joran, had lost his entire family in a pirate raid on their merchant vessel. He'd survived only because, in the moment of maximum terror, when raiders burst into the cargo hold where he'd been hiding, he'd somehow made himself unseeable, Not invisible exactly, he could still see his own body, but unnoticeable, as if he'd convinced the universe to forget he existed for those crucial minutes. The pirates had searched the hold thoroughly, had passed within arm's reach of where he crouched behind storage containers, and never once looked in his direction. Later, rescue crews had found him nearly catatonic with shock and dehydration, but alive. He'd tried to explain what he'd done, how he'd survived, but no one believed him. They thought it was trauma-induced delusion, a child's mind creating a comforting fantasy to cope with impossible horror. But Jaren knew the truth. He'd touched something, used something, accessed some power that saved his life. He'd tried to replicate it dozens of times since, sitting in his room at the orphanage on Eshan, concentrating until his head throbbed, trying to recapture that sensation of becoming nothing, of slipping between the cracks of reality. Sometimes he thought he felt it again, a momentary flicker where he seemed to fade, but he could never sustain it, could never control it. The Rhodian child, Biko, came from a family of merchants who considered force sensitivity a genetic defect, something shameful to be hidden from neighbors and business associates. Biko's ability manifested as empathic sensitivity so acute it was painful. The young Rhodian could feel the emotions of everyone nearby, waves of joy and anger and sadness and fear washing over them constantly, making it almost impossible to distinguish their own feelings from the emotional noise of others. In crowded places like markets or spaceports, the sensation became overwhelming, driving Biko to hide in dark corners with hands pressed over their auditory receptors, trying to block out the emotional cacophony. Biko's parents had tried everything to make the ability go away. They'd consulted doctors who prescribed medications that dulled all sensation. They'd visited faith healers who performed elaborate rituals meant to exorcise what they believed were malevolent spirits. They'd even considered more extreme measures, medical interventions that would damage the neural pathways believed responsible for force sensitivity. Only the intervention of a sympathetic physician, someone who recognized what Biko actually was, had prevented them from going through with it. The Miri-alien girl, Senna, experienced something entirely different. She had visions. Not constantly, not controllably, but at random moments an image would superimpose itself over her normal vision, showing her something that hadn't happened yet. Sometimes the visions were trivial. A friend dropping a glass 5 minutes before it occurred, giving Senna time to warn them. Sometimes they were more significant. A vision of her younger brother falling from a balcony led her to insist he stay inside that day, likely saving his life when strong winds damaged the structure hours later. But the visions were never clear, never complete. They came wrapped in symbolism and metaphor, showing her echoes and shadows rather than concrete details. She learned to interpret them through painful trial and error, gradually developing an intuition for what the images meant. But she was never certain, never confident. The uncertainty was agonizing, knowing she might be seeing something important, something that could save lives or prevent disasters, but not knowing what exactly she was seeing or how to act on it. Cassia, the human girl from Alderaan, had a different gift entirely. She could sense the life force of plants, feel their slow, patient consciousness in ways that ordinary beings couldn't. In her family's extensive gardens, she could walk among thousands of different species, and know which ones were thriving, which ones were sick, which ones needed more water or sunlight or specific nutrients. Gardeners twice her age with decades of experience couldn't match her innate understanding of what each plant needed. But this ability came with a curse. She felt it when plants died. When workers trimmed hedges or pulled weeds or harvested crops, Cassia experienced echoes of their ending, small deaths that left her emotionally drained. Her parents thought she was overly sensitive, too attached to mere vegetation. They couldn't understand that to Cassia, these weren't mere plants but living beings with their own form of awareness, their own right to exist. Killing them felt like murder, even when done for practical purposes. A human boy named Tarsin from Karelia could make small objects move with his thoughts, but only when he wasn't trying. The ability activated in moments of intense emotion, anger, fear, joy, causing items to lift or slide across surfaces. His parents thought their apartment was haunted until they realized the disturbances only occurred when Tarsin was present. They'd adapted, learning to avoid startling him, keeping breakables secured, treating his ability as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a gift to be developed. A Togruta girl named Rila experienced something she called time echoes. When she touched certain objects, especially old ones, she'd sometimes perceive flashes of their history. A worn book might show her the person who'd read it most frequently. An old tool could reveal the hands that had wielded it, the work it had performed. The visions were brief and fragmentary, never showing complete events, but they gave her a sense of connection to the past that both comforted and disturbed her. These were the children who'd been called, not the strongest force sensitives. Those were usually identified early by Jedi recruiters and brought to the temple on Coruscant for proper training. These were the ones who'd slipped through the cracks, who came from worlds where the Jedi rarely visited, from families who didn't recognize force sensitivity for what it was, from circumstances that had kept them isolated and uncertain. They'd all felt the same pull, that irresistible compulsion to go outside, to approach the mysterious ship, to board despite every rational warning against doing so. And now, gathered together in this impossible vessel, they were finally experiencing something they'd each been denied their entire lives. The knowledge that they weren't alone, that others shared their strange gifts, that they weren't broken or defective or cursed, but part of something larger and more wonderful than they'd imagined. Kyle shared his own story, found himself speaking more honestly than he ever had before. He told him about feeling his mother's sadness, about knowing when Mira would fall, about the constant sense that reality was larger and stranger than what he'd been taught to see. He admitted his doubt, his skepticism, his fear that believing in something beyond the physical world would make him weak or foolish. "I used to think that too," Joran said quietly, that acknowledging the Force meant giving up on logic and reason. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think the Force is just another part of reality, like gravity or electromagnetism. We don't understand it fully yet, but that doesn't make it any less real. Varen appeared among them again, moving down the aisle with fluid grace. The conductor stopped beside Coyle's seat and looked down at him with those amber eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the essential truth beneath. "You've begun to feel it," Varen observed. the connections between yourself and others, the currents of the force as they flow through this vessel. How does it feel? Kyle considered the question carefully. Like coming home, he said finally. Like finding something I didn't know I'd lost. Varen smiled. An excellent description. The force is our home in the deepest sense. It is where we come from and where we return to, the source and the destination. But to truly understand it, you must be willing to let it change you. Are you prepared for that? I don't know, Coyle admitted. I want to be, but I'm scared. Good, Varen said. Fear is not the enemy. Ignorance is the enemy. Fear is simply information telling you that something matters, that you care about the outcome. The question is not whether you're afraid, but what you do with that fear. Do you let it stop you, or do you acknowledge it and move forward anyway? Before Cale could respond, the ship shuddered. A deep, resonant tone filled the compartment, vibrating through the walls and floor and ceiling. Outside the viewing ports, hyperspace began to collapse back into normal reality, the twisted colors and impossible shapes resolving into the familiar stars and darkness of real space. We have arrived, Varen announced, their voice carrying to every corner of the compartment. Behold, the ice moon of Hoth's northern pole, home to the temple of eternal winter. Kyle pressed his face against the viewing port, and his breath caught in his throat. Below them, filling the entire frame of the window, was a moon of impossible beauty. It was covered entirely in ice and snow, its surface a landscape of frozen mountains and vast glacial plains that sparkled in the light of the distant star it orbited. But what made it truly extraordinary was the aurora. Waves of color danced across the moon's atmosphere. Brilliant greens and blues and purples and golds swirling and flowing like living things, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost conscious. The aurora pulsed with a rhythm that Cale could feel even through the ship's hull, a heartbeat that resonated with his own. The aurora is the force made visible, Varen explained. In this place, at this time, the barrier between the physical and the spiritual is so thin that the force itself can be seen by those with eyes to see it. The colors you perceive are not just light, but emotion, intention, the collective consciousness of all living things touching this place and being touched by it in return. The ship began its descent, gliding through the moon's thin atmosphere with barely a tremor. As they dropped lower, details of the surface became visible. Mountains that seemed carved from a single piece of ice, their peaks impossibly sharp and gleaming. Canyons that plunged into darkness, their depths unknown and unknowable. And there, in the distance, rising from a plateau of pristine snow, a structure that could only be the temple. It was built from the same ice as the mountains, but shaped and refined by hands that understood the force's nature. The temple was a symphony of spires and domes, of arches and pillars, all flowing together in a design that was both organic and intentional. The aurora danced above it, seeming to focus there, to concentrate its energy on that single point like light through a lens. The ship touched down on the plateau with barely a whisper, settling into the snow as if it belonged there. Through the viewing ports, Cale could see that the temperature outside must be far below freezing, but somehow he wasn't afraid of the cold. The force was here, thick and present in a way he'd never experienced before, and it felt like protection, like welcome, like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. "Before you disembark," Varen said, and all the children turned to face the conductor, "understand this. What awaits you in the temple is not a lesson you can fail. It is an experience, a revelation. You will each face something different, something personal, something that speaks to your individual journey. Trust in the Force. Trust in yourself. And most importantly, trust that you were meant to be here in this moment for reasons that will become clear in their own time." The boarding ramp extended and a blast of cold air rushed into the compartment. But it wasn't the biting, painful cold Cal had expected. It was crisp and clean, refreshing rather than harsh, carrying with it a scent like nothing he'd ever smelled before. Like winter itself had a fragrance, like ice and starlight and ancient secrets. One by one, the children filed down the ramp and onto the snowy plateau. Kyle's boots crunched in the fresh powder, and he looked up at the temple looming before them. It was even more magnificent up close, its ice walls carved with symbols and images that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Scenes of ancient battles and peaceful meditations of Jedi knights and their trials, of the endless cycle of light and dark, conflict and harmony, death and rebirth. The aurora overhead painted everything in shifting colors, and Kale realized he could feel it now, could sense the Force flowing through those curtains of light, could almost hear it singing with a voice that was every voice and no voice, that spoke in a language older than words. Nyla came to stand beside him, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "It's incredible," she whispered. "It's home," Kyle replied, and knew it was true. Viran led them toward the temple's entrance, a massive archway carved from solid ice that pulsed with inner light. As they approached, the light grew brighter, warmer, more inviting, and Kale felt something shift inside him, some fundamental barrier between what he'd been and what he was becoming, beginning to dissolve. The journey had brought him here. The tests that awaited would transform him. And somewhere deep in his soul, in that place where the whispers lived and the knowing resided, Kale understood that nothing would ever be the same again. He took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, felt the Force flowing through him and around him and in him, and stepped forward into the light. The entrance to the Temple of Eternal Winter swallowed them whole, not with darkness, but with light. The archway led into a vast antechamber where the ice walls themselves seemed to glow from within, radiating a soft blue luminescence that eliminated any need for artificial lighting. The temperature, which Kale had expected to be brutally cold, was instead perfectly comfortable, as if the temple itself maintained an environment suited to living beings despite being constructed entirely from frozen water. The floor beneath their feet was ice as well, but not slippery. Instead, it provided perfect traction, its surface somehow textured in a way that defied the normal properties of ice. Carved into this floor were intricate patterns, geometric designs that flowed and connected in ways that made Kale's eyes water if he tried to follow them too closely. They reminded him of the hypnotic spirals he'd seen in certain Naboo artwork, patterns meant to induce meditative states. Varen stopped in the center of the antechamber and turned to face the assembled children. In the temple's blue light, the conductor's features seemed even more ethereal, as if Varen existed partially in this world and partially in some other, more rarefied reality. "We have entered the temple," Varan said, and their voice echoed strangely, multiplying and harmonizing with itself until it seemed like a chorus was speaking. "But before you proceed further, you must understand what this place is and what it represents." The children gathered closer, forming a semicircle around the conductor. Kyle noticed that he wasn't the only one whose breath had quickened, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Neela's leku were twitching constantly, a sign of nervous energy among Twi'leks. Joran stood with the rigid posture of Achani martial training, but Kale could sense the boy's underlying tension. Even Biko, the young Rhodian who'd seemed so timid on the ship, now stood straighter, as if the temple itself was lending them all courage. "This temple was built nearly 4,000 years ago," Varan explained, "by a sect of Jedi who believed that the Force could be understood not through combat or politics, but through contemplation and communion with the natural order. They chose this moon because of its unique properties. The ice here is not ordinary frozen water. It is infused with kyber crystals, microscopic fragments distributed throughout the moon's core. These crystals resonate with the Force, amplifying it, making it visible and tangible in ways that exist nowhere else in the known galaxy." Varan gestured upward, and Kale followed the motion to see that the ceiling of the antechamber was not solid, but instead open to the sky. The aurora danced overhead so close it seemed he could reach up and touch those flowing ribbons of color. And perhaps, in this place, he actually could. "The aurora you see is the Force itself," Varan continued, "not a representation or a symbol, but the actual living energy that binds all things. Here, in this confluence of kyber crystal and magnetic field and the turning of seasons, the Force becomes visible to even those without sensitivity to it. For those of you who can touch the Force, the experience is exponentially more profound." As if responding to Varan's words, the aurora pulsed brighter, and Kale felt it, not just saw it, not just sensed it distantly, but felt it like a physical touch against his skin. The sensation was overwhelming, like being submerged in an ocean of pure emotion, pure intention, pure connection to everything that lived and had ever lived and would ever live. His knees weakened, and he might have fallen if Nyla hadn't grabbed his arm, steadying him even as she herself swayed. "Breathe," Varan instructed gently. "The Force here is intense, concentrated in a way that can overwhelm those not accustomed to it. Do not try to control it or understand it. Simply allow it to flow through you. You cannot drown in the Force, though it may feel that way initially. Trust it. Trust yourself." Kyle did as instructed, focusing on his breathing, in through his nose, out through his mouth, slow and steady. With each breath, the overwhelming sensation became more manageable, less like drowning and more like swimming, less like chaos and more like an intricate dance where he was learning the steps as he moved. Around him, the other children were having similar experiences. Some were handling it better than others. Senna, the Mirialian girl with prophetic visions, seemed almost at ease, her eyes closed and a small smile on her face, as if she was hearing beautiful music. Cassia, the Alderaanian who could sense plant life, was crying quietly, but not from sadness. Tears of wonder streamed down her face as she experienced the Force in its purest, most undiluted form. "Each of you will now proceed deeper into the temple," Varan said. "You will go alone. though you are never truly alone while the force surrounds you. The temple will guide you to where you need to be, show you what you need to see. Some of what you experience will be pleasant. Some will be challenging. All of it will be true in the way that matters most. Are you ready? No one spoke, but Cale could sense the collective agreement, the shared determination. They had come this far. They would see it through. Then go, Varen said, and gestured toward multiple corridors that led away from the antechamber. Cale hadn't noticed them before, but now he saw there were dozens of passages, each one glowing with its own subtle variation of the blue light, each one calling to specific individuals in the group. Cale felt the pull toward one particular corridor, a passage to his right that seemed slightly warmer than the others, that promised something he couldn't name but desperately wanted to find. He moved toward it without conscious decision, his feet carrying him forward as if they knew the way better than his mind did. Behind him, he heard Nyla call out, "Good luck!" And he turned to see her heading toward a different passage, one that pulsed with green light. All around the antechamber, children were separating, each drawn to their own path, their own experience. Within moments, Cale was alone in his corridor, the sounds of the others fading behind him, until there was only the soft whisper of his own breathing and the quiet hum of the force. The corridor was narrow, just wide enough for Cale to walk without his shoulders touching the walls. The ice on either side was perfectly smooth, almost like glass, and as he walked, he could see his reflection keeping pace with him, but it wasn't quite his reflection. The figure in the ice was him, but older, taller, with the bearing of confidence he didn't yet possess. The reflection that wasn't smiled at him, encouraging, and then faded as he continued forward. The corridor began to slope downward, descending into the heart of the moon. Cale had no idea how far he walked. Time felt meaningless here, elastic and unreliable. It might have been minutes or hours when the corridor finally opened into a chamber that stole his breath completely. It was a cavern of impossible proportions, carved from solid ice but vast enough to hold a starship. The walls soared upward until they vanished into darkness, and scattered throughout the chamber were formations that looked like frozen waterfalls, cascades of ice suspended in mid-flow, eternally falling but never reaching the ground. And everywhere, embedded in the ice like stars in the night sky, were kyber crystals, thousands upon thousands of them, ranging in size from grains of sand to formations as large as Cale's entire body. They glowed with internal light, each one a different color: blue, green, yellow, purple, even rare shades of white and black. The light from these crystals reflected off the ice walls, creating a kaleidoscope of color that danced and shifted with every tiny movement of air in the chamber. In the center of this crystal cavern was a single structure that drew Cale's attention immediately. It was a raised platform, circular and perhaps 10 meters in diameter, with a surface that looked like it was made from compressed snow rather than solid ice. And in the exact center of this platform stood a figure. Cale's heart stuttered. The figure was humanoid, wearing robes of simple brown cloth, a hood covering their face. In their hands, they held a walking stick carved from some dark wood, and they stood with the patient stillness of someone who had been waiting a very long time and was content to wait longer still. "Hello, Cale," the figure said, and the voice was kind, warm, grandfatherly. "I've been expecting you." Cale approached slowly, his boots leaving impressions in the thin layer of snow that covered the chamber floor. "Who are you?" he asked, though part of him wondered if he was ready for the answer. The figure lowered their hood, revealing the face of an elderly human man with a long white beard and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and gentle humor. He looked like someone's grandfather, like the kind old man who ran the bakery near Cale's apartment and always had an extra treat for children who visited his shop. "Who I am is less important than who you are," the old man said. "But if you need a name, you may call me Master Corrin. I was a Jedi consular who helped build this temple many centuries ago. Or rather, I was. Now I am something else. A memory, perhaps. An echo in the Force. A teacher for those who need teaching." "Are you a ghost?" Kyle asked, the word feeling inadequate even as he spoke it. Corrin chuckled. "Ghost, Force spirit, linger in consciousness. Choose whichever term helps you understand. The Force preserves those who serve it faithfully in ways that defy simple explanation. I chose to remain here, in this place, to guide younglings like yourself who come seeking answers." Kyle stepped onto the platform, and immediately the crystals around the chamber flared brighter. The aurora overhead intensified, its colors more vivid, more alive. He could feel the Force thick as honey in the air, could taste it on his tongue like electricity before a storm. "I don't know what I'm seeking," Coyle admitted. "I came here because I felt called. Because I needed to know if the Force is real, if I'm really capable of touching it, or if I've been fooling myself my entire life." Master Corrin nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "The doubt is strong in you, stronger than the fear, stronger than the hope. You've built walls around your heart, barriers of skepticism and rationality that you believe protect you from disappointment, but those same walls keep you from experiencing the truth of what you are." The old Jedi gestured with his walking stick, and one of the larger crystals nearby detached from the wall. It floated through the air, spinning gently until it came to rest, hovering between Coyle and Master Corrin. It was perhaps the size of Cale's fist, multifaceted and glowing with a soft blue light. "Do you know what a kyber crystal is?" Corrin asked. "They're used in lightsabers," Kyle said, remembering his research about the Jedi. "They focus the blade's energy." "True, but incomplete," Corrin said. "Kyber crystals are living things in their way. They grow, they change, they resonate with the Force. Each crystal is unique, attuned to specific individuals, responsive to certain frequencies of Force energy. When a Jedi constructs their lightsaber, they do not simply choose a crystal. The crystal chooses them." The floating crystal pulsed, and Cale felt an answering resonance in his chest, like a chord being struck on an instrument he didn't know he possessed. "What does it want from me?" "Not want," Corrin corrected gently. "What does it offer you? What does it show you about yourself?" He nodded toward the crystal. "Touch it, not with your hand, but with your mind. Reach out through the Force and connect with it. Let it show you what it sees." Kyle hesitated. Everything in his rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that crystals couldn't see or know or choose, that the Force was a comforting mythology rather than a measurable reality. But he'd come too far to let doubt stop him now. He'd boarded a mysterious ship, traveled to an ice moon, entered an impossible temple, he'd felt the force flowing through him like a living river. He knew the truth, even if part of him still resisted accepting it. He closed his eyes and reached out, not with his physical senses, but with something deeper, something that had no name, but that he'd been using unconsciously his entire life. He extended his awareness toward the crystal, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The moment his consciousness touched the crystals, the world exploded. Kyle was no longer standing on the platform in the crystal cavern. He was everywhere and everywhen at once, experiencing time as a Jedi might experience it, not as a linear progression, but as a vast tapestry where past and present and future existed simultaneously. He saw himself as a child, younger than he was now, playing with Mira in their apartment. He felt the love between them, pure and uncomplicated, a bond that would define both their lives. He saw his parents, struggling to make ends meet, but never complaining, never letting their children see how close to the edge they lived. He felt their fear for him, their worry about his isolation, his skepticism, his inability to connect with other children who didn't share his strange sensitivity. Then the vision shifted, and he saw himself as an older youth, perhaps 15 or 16. He was training with a lightsaber, the familiar weight of the weapon in his hand, feeling completely natural. Around him were other students, some human, some alien, all focused on their practice. He felt determination radiating from his future self, a sense of purpose he couldn't quite grasp in the present moment. The vision shifted again, and now he saw darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of night, but something deeper, more malevolent. He saw himself standing on a battlefield, surrounded by chaos and destruction. Ships burned in the sky above. The ground was scorched and broken, and advancing toward him were figures in armor, their faces hidden behind helmets, their weapons raised to kill. Kyle felt his future self's fear, but also his resolve. He saw himself raise his lightsaber, the blue blade igniting with a snap hiss that seemed to cut through the chaos. He saw himself defend those who couldn't defend themselves, saw himself make choices that would save lives and end lives in equal measure. Then the darkest vision yet. He saw himself, older still, perhaps in his 20s, standing before a choice. On one side, a path of light, of service, of sacrifice. On the other, a path of power, of control, of domination. And in that moment, watching from outside himself, Kale couldn't tell which path his future self would choose. The vision was unclear, the outcome uncertain, as if the decision hadn't been made yet, as if the future was still fluid and his choices in the present would determine which reality came to pass. The crystal released him, and Kale gasped, stumbling backward. Master Corran caught him with surprising strength for someone so elderly, steadying him until he found his balance. "What was that?" Kale demanded, his voice shaking. "What did I just see?" "Possibilities," Corran said calmly. "The Force does not show us certainty, only potential. You saw fragments of what might be, paths you could walk, futures that are neither guaranteed nor impossible. The Force offers us glimpses so that we can make informed choices, but it never removes our agency. We are not prisoners of destiny, Kale. We are its co-authors." Kale looked at the crystal, which had settled gently onto the platform's surface, still glowing but now quiescent. "The darkness I saw, the battlefield, the choice between light and dark, is that what's waiting for me? Is that my future? It is a possible future, Corrin acknowledged. The galaxy stands on the edge of great upheaval. Conflicts are brewing that will shake the foundations of the Republic. The Jedi Order will be tested in ways it hasn't been tested in generations. And those of your generation, children who come into their Force sensitivity during these turbulent times, will have to make choices that will define not just your own lives, but the fate of countless others. The old Jedi's expression grew grave. But I did not bring you here to frighten you with visions of what might be. I brought you here to show you what you are capable of. You touched the Force, Kale. You connected with a kyber crystal and received its wisdom. Do you still doubt that you're Force sensitive? Do you still wonder if this is all elaborate delusion? Kyle thought about lying, about maintaining the comfortable skepticism that had protected him for so long, but he couldn't. Not here, not now, not after everything he'd experienced. No, he said quietly, I don't doubt anymore. I can feel it. The Force, it's real, and I'm part of it, connected to it in ways I'm only beginning to understand. Good, Corrin said, and his smile was proud, approving. That acceptance is the first step on a journey that will last the rest of your life. But acceptance alone is not enough. You must also commit. You must decide whether you will embrace this gift you've been given, whether you will train yourself to use it wisely and well, or whether you will turn away from it and try to live an ordinary life. Can I? Kyle asked. Turn away from it, I mean. Can someone just ignore the Force once they know it's real? In a manner of speaking, Corrin said, you can choose not to develop your abilities, not to seek training, not to engage with the Force actively. But you cannot unknow what you now know. You cannot unfeel what you now feel. The Force is part of you, woven into your very being. Ignoring it would be like trying to ignore your own heartbeat. Possible, perhaps, but it requires constant effort and comes at great cost to your spiritual and emotional well-being. The old Jedi gestured around the chamber at the thousands of crystals embedded in the walls. Each of these crystals represents a potential. Each one is waiting for someone to claim it, to build it into a lightsaber, to use it in service of the Force. And each one knows that many will never be chosen, that they will remain here in this temple until the moon itself crumbles to dust. They do not regret this. They do not mourn their unrealized potential. They simply exist, trusting that their purpose will be fulfilled in its own time, in its own way. What's your point? Kale asked, though he suspected he already knew. My point is that you have a choice to make. Not now, not today, but soon. You can be like these unchosen crystals existing with potential that is never realized. Or you can allow yourself to be claimed by your destiny, to be shaped and refined into something that serves a purpose greater than yourself. Neither choice is wrong, Kyle, but one of them will fulfill you and the other will leave you forever wondering what might have been. Before Kale could respond, the chamber began to change. The walls seemed to ripple, becoming translucent, and through them, Kale could see the other children, not physically present, but visible as if through a scrying glass, each one in their own chamber having their own experience. He saw Nyla standing before what looked like a projection of her own future, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed something both beautiful and terrible. He saw Joran engaged in combat with a figure made of shadow, his Echani training evident in every movement. He saw little Biko surrounded by glowing orbs of light that seemed to respond to the Rhodian child's emotions, pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeat. They are all being tested, Corin explained, each according to their nature, each shown what they most need to see. The Force is infinitely adaptable, infinitely personal. It speaks to each individual in the language they best understand. For you, that language is visions of possibility and choice. For others, it is different. The images faded, and Kale found himself once again alone with Master Corin in the crystal chamber. The old Jedi picked up his walking stick and began to move toward the edge of the platform. "Our time together is nearly over," he said, "but before you leave this chamber, I want you to take something with you." He gestured to the crystal that had shown Coil his visions. It rose from the platform and floated toward the boy, coming to rest in his outstretched hand. The moment his fingers closed around it, Coil felt a surge of warmth, of connection, of rightness. This crystal was his. Perhaps it had always been his, waiting here for 11 years for him to find it. "Keep that safe," Corin instructed. "When the time comes for you to construct your lightsaber, that crystal will be its heart. But that time is not yet. First, you must find a teacher, must train in the ways of the Force, must learn to control the power that flows through you. The crystal will wait. It is patient. Be patient as well." Kyle slipped the crystal into his pocket, feeling its weight, its presence, like carrying a piece of the Force itself. "What do I do now? How do I find a teacher? The Jedi don't exactly advertise their training programs." Corin's laugh was gentle. "The Force will guide you, as it has guided you to this place. Trust in it. When you return to your normal life, opportunities will present themselves. People will enter your path who can help you grow. Stay open to these possibilities. Don't let your old skepticism wall you off from the gifts the universe is trying to give you." The old Jedi began to fade, becoming translucent, his form losing solidity. "Remember this place," his voice echoed. "Remember what you learned here, and remember that you are never alone. The Force is always with you, always accessible, always ready to guide you if you're willing to listen. May the Force be with you, Kyle Vrias." Then he was gone, and Kyle stood alone on the platform in the crystal chamber. But he didn't feel alone. He felt connected, part of something vast and eternal and incomprehensibly beautiful. He felt the Force flowing through him and around him, felt the presence of every living thing on this moon and beyond it, felt the threads that linked him to Nyla and Jorin and all the other children who'd made this journey. He looked up at the aurora dancing overhead, and for the first time in his life, he understood what he was seeing. Not just light, not just magnetic phenomena, but the visible manifestation of the Force itself, the energy that connected all things, that bound the galaxy together in ways that transcended mere physics. Kyle took a deep breath, feeling that energy fill his lungs, feeling it flow through his bloodstream, feeling it settle into his bones like it had always belonged there. Then he turned and walked back toward the corridor he'd entered from, ready to rejoin the others, ready to continue this journey wherever it led. The corridor seemed shorter on the return trip, or perhaps Kale was simply less afraid, more confident in his steps. When he emerged into the antechamber, he found several other children already there. each one wearing an expression similar to what he imagined was on his own face, a mixture of wonder and solemnity and profound change. Neela saw him first and rushed over, grabbing his hands. "Did you see?" she asked urgently. "Did you see what the Force showed you?" "I saw," Kyle confirmed. "Did you?" She nodded, her leku twitching with residual emotion. "I saw my home world. I saw Ryloth being attacked, saw my family in danger, and I saw myself, older, fighting to protect them. I saw myself as a Jedi Knight. Kyle, an actual Jedi with a lightsaber and everything. I didn't think that was possible for someone like me, from a world like mine. But the Force showed me it was not only possible, it was meant to be." More children emerged from their corridors, each one carrying their own revelations, their own transformative experiences. Joran spoke of confronting his fear of abandonment and learning that true strength came from connection, not isolation. Cassia described communing with ancient tree-like Force entities that taught her the patience and perspective of beings who measured time in centuries rather than years. Little Biko, clutching their stuffed toy, whispered about meeting a vision of their future self who told them they would be a great healer, someone who mended not just bodies, but spirits. As they shared their stories, Kale realized something profound. They were no longer just children who happened to be Force sensitive. They were a community, bound together by shared experience and collective transformation. They had each faced their trials alone, but they would carry the memory of this night together, a bond that would connect them no matter how far apart their paths might diverge. Varen appeared among them again, materializing so smoothly that Coyle wondered if the conductor had been there all along, simply unseen. "You have each completed your journey through the temple," Varen said, pride evident in their ageless voice. "You have faced your fears, accepted your gifts, and glimpsed your potential. The Force has shown you what you needed to see, and you have proven yourselves worthy of its trust." The conductor gestured toward the entrance they'd come through, and Kale saw that the aurora outside had changed. Where before it had been primarily blue and green, now it incorporated every color imaginable, a full spectrum celebration that pulsed with joy and approval. "The Temple of Eternal Winter has one final gift for each of you," Varen continued, "a remembrance of this night, a token to carry with you as proof that what you experienced was real." The conductor raised their hands, and from the depths of the temple came floating spheres of soft light, each one drifting to a specific child and settling into their palms. Kyle's sphere was warm and pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. As he watched, it solidified, transforming into a small medallion attached to a silver chain. The medallion was carved from ice that somehow didn't melt, depicting the symbol of the Jedi Order, a stylized representation of wings and a rising sun. "These tokens are linked to this place," Varen explained. "No matter where you go, no matter how far you travel, you will always be able to feel the temple's presence. In your darkest moments, in times of doubt and fear, touch this medallion and remember what you learned here. Remember that you are connected to something larger than yourself, that you are never truly alone." Kale slipped the chain over his head, feeling the cool weight of the medallion settle against his chest. The moment it touched his skin, he felt a surge of connection, as if invisible threads were linking him to every other person who'd ever received such a token, to every Force-sensitive being who'd stood in this temple and experienced its revelations. "Now," Varan said, "it is time to return. The night grows long, and your families will wonder where you've gone. The ship awaits to carry you home." They filed out of the temple back onto the snowy plateau where the ancient vessel waited. The aurora overhead seemed to wave farewell, its ribbons of color rippling in patterns that looked almost like words in a language Cale couldn't read, but somehow understood. The temple itself seemed to pulse with light as they departed, as if bidding them well on their journeys. Inside the ship, the children settled into their seats with a quiet reverence that was very different from the nervous excitement of the journey here. They were changed. They were beginning to understand what that change meant. As the vessel lifted off, leaving the ice moon of Hoth's northern pole behind, Cale looked back through the viewing port. The temple grew smaller, becoming just a point of light among the ice and snow. But he could still feel it, could sense its presence, even as they accelerated away. The medallion against his chest grew warm, confirming what he already knew. He would carry this place with him forever, not just in memory, but in the very fabric of his being. The journey back through hyperspace passed in quiet contemplation. Some children slept, exhausted by the intensity of their experiences. Others stared out the viewing ports, watching reality twist and flow in patterns that no longer seemed quite so alien, quite so impossible. Cale found himself in conversation with Senna, the Myrialian prophet, comparing what they'd each learned. "I saw the war," Senna said quietly, her geometric tattoo seeming to shift in the dim light. "The one that's coming. I've been seeing it in fragments for months, but tonight the Force showed me clearly. There's a darkness rising, Cale. Something that will challenge everything the Jedi stand for. Something that will force all of us to choose sides." "I saw it too," Cale admitted, "or a version of it. Master Corrin, the Force spirit I met, he said the galaxy was standing on the edge of great upheaval. He said our generation would have to make choices that would define the fate of countless others." Senna nodded slowly. "My vision showed me that some of us won't survive what's coming. Some will fall to the dark side. Some will sacrifice themselves to protect others. But it also showed me that together, if we trust in the Force and in each other, we can weather the storm. We can emerge on the other side changed, but not broken." It was a sobering thought, but somehow Cale didn't feel frightened. He felt prepared, or at least more prepared than he'd been before this night. He had knowledge now, understanding, a foundation upon which to build. Whatever the future held, he would face it with open eyes and an open heart. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, time flowing strangely in hyperspace. Eventually, Varan announced they were approaching their destinations. "Each of you will be returned to the exact moment you left," the conductor explained. "No time will have passed in your world, though you have spent hours in mine. Your families will not know you were gone, but you will know. You will carry the truth of this night with you, always." One by one, the ship stopped at different worlds, letting children off to return to their ordinary lives that would never be quite ordinary again. Cale watched as Nyla departed on Reloth, as Joran stepped off into the night on Ashan, as little Biko scurried down the ramp on Rhodia. Each departure felt like losing a piece of himself. These connections formed over mere hours, but feeling as deep as bonds forged over years. Finally, the ship descended through Naboo's atmosphere, gliding through the snow that still fell in Theed, touching down on the same street it had lifted off from. Varen came to stand beside Kale's seat as he prepared to depart. "What happens now?" Kale asked. "After tonight? Do I just go back to my normal life and pretend none of this happened?" "You could never pretend that," Varen said with a gentle smile. "And you shouldn't try. What happens now is you live, Kale. You make choices. You grow. You learn to trust the Force and let it guide you. The Jedi will find you when the time is right, or perhaps you will find them. The Force has a way of bringing together those who are meant to meet." The conductor placed a hand on Kale's shoulder. "You have a great destiny ahead of you. Not great in the sense of famous or powerful necessarily, but great in the sense of meaningful, of consequential. The choices you make will ripple outward, affecting more lives than you can imagine. Trust in that. Trust in yourself. And never forget what you learned this night." Kyle stood and made his way to the boarding ramp. At the threshold, he turned back one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Varen bowed slightly. "It was my honor to be your guide. May the Force be with you, Kale Vrees, always." Then Kale was walking down the ramp, his boots crunching in fresh snow, the medallion warm against his chest, and the kyber crystal a comfortable weight in his pocket. The ship lifted off behind him, rising silently into the snowy sky until it vanished as if it had never been there at all. Kyle looked up at his apartment building. In the window, he could see his own face pressed against the glass, watching the street below. He smiled, understanding now that he was seeing himself from just a few hours ago, from the moment before he'd made the choice to board the mysterious ship. He walked up the stairs, entered the apartment, and stood for a moment watching his younger self by the window. Then, as if responding to some unspoken signal, that version of himself turned away from the window and moved toward the door, beginning the journey that would bring him to where he now stood. Time resolved itself. The paradox collapsed. Kyle was suddenly back in his sleeping mat, the covers pulled tight, his family sleeping in the other rooms. Had it been a dream? Had any of it been real? Then he felt the medallion around his neck, reached into his pocket and found the kyber crystal, closed his eyes, and sensed the Force flowing through him and around him, present and powerful and unmistakably real. It had happened. All of it. He had traveled to the Temple of Eternal Winter, had met a Force spirit, had glimpsed his own possible futures, had been transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Kale settled back into his sleeping mat, the crystal clasped in one hand, the medallion resting against his chest. Tomorrow, his ordinary life would resume, but he would never be ordinary again. He was Force-sensitive. He had potential. He had purpose. And somewhere in the galaxy, in a temple on Coruscant or a hidden academy on a remote world, there were Jedi who would one day help him realize that potential, who would train him and guide him and prepare him for the trials ahead. Kyle closed his eyes and let sleep claim him, his dreams filled with visions of lightsabers and distant stars, of battles fought and won, of a future that was no longer terrifying but full of promise and possibility. The Force was with him. It would always be with him, and that made all the difference. 20 years had passed since that winter night, when Kale Vrees had boarded a mysterious ship and traveled to a temple that existed between myth and reality. 20 years during which the galaxy had transformed in ways that the young boy pressing his face against that frost-covered window could never have imagined, ways that were both more wonderful and more terrible than the visions shown to him by a kyber crystal in an ice cavern. Kyle stood now on the observation deck of a Republic Star Destroyer, watching Coruscant's endless cityscape scroll past beneath them. He was 31 years old, a Jedi Knight in his prime, and the meditation chamber on the ice moon of Hoth's northern pole felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The Clone Wars raged across the galaxy. The conflict that Senna the Mirialian prophet had foreseen, that Master Corran's spirit had warned about, had finally erupted into full-scale war. The separatist movement, led by Count Dooku, a former Jedi who turned to the dark side, had fractured the Republic. Millions had died. Trillions more lived under the shadow of violence and uncertainty. And through it all, the Jedi had been thrust into a role they'd never been meant to play. No longer peacekeepers and diplomats, they were now generals and warriors, leading clone armies into battle across countless worlds. The change had been gradual, subtle enough that many hadn't recognized it for the corruption it represented until it was far too late to turn back. Kyle touched the medallion that still hung around his neck, hidden beneath his Jedi robes. He'd worn it every day for 2 decades, through his discovery by a Jedi recruiter on Naboo, through his years as a youngling in the Jedi Temple, through his apprenticeship to Master Talia Kor, through his trials and his knighting ceremony. It had never tarnished, never lost its connection to that place, where the Force itself was visible, where possibility and choice had first revealed themselves to him. Deep thoughts, young Vries? The voice belonged to his former master, Talia Kor, a Zabrak woman whose horned cranium was decorated with intricate tattoos that marked her lineage. She'd been his teacher for 12 years, had shaped him from a promising but uncertain youngling into the Jedi he'd become. "Just remembering," Kyle said, turning to face her. "How different things were. How much has changed." Talia moved to stand beside him, her own gaze turning toward the planet below. "Change is the nature of the Force," she said, a teaching she'd repeated countless times over the years. "Nothing remains static. Everything flows, transforms, becomes something new. The question is whether we flow with it or allow ourselves to be battered by currents we refuse to acknowledge." "Master Yoda says we're losing our way," Kyle said quietly. "He believes the Jedi have become too involved in politics, too focused on military victory rather than understanding. He thinks we're blind to dangers that should be obvious." "Master Yoda is wise," Talia acknowledged. "But even wisdom can become paralysis if it prevents action when action is needed. The Separatists would crush the Republic if we stood aside. The alternative to our involvement isn't peace. It's subjugation under Dooku and his dark side allies." The argument was familiar. Kale had heard it 1,000 times from 100 different Jedi, all trying to justify their participation in a war that felt fundamentally wrong despite the rightness of their cause. They were trapped in a paradox where every choice led to suffering, where inaction and action both had terrible consequences. His hand went to his lightsaber, hanging from his belt. The weapon he'd constructed at 16, using the blue kyber crystal given to him by the Force itself on that winter night so long ago. The crystal had called to him from his pocket throughout his youngling years, patient as Master Corrin had promised it would be, waiting until Kale had learned enough to channel its power properly. When he'd finally assembled the lightsaber, fitting the crystal into the hilt he'd crafted with his own hands, the weapon had ignited with a blade of the purest blue he'd ever seen, blue like the ice of the temple, blue like the aurora that had danced overhead while the Force revealed its mysteries. Looking at that blade, Kyle had felt the same connection he'd experienced in the crystal chamber, the same sense of rightness and purpose. But lately, that connection felt strained. The war was changing him, changing all the Jedi. They spoke of defending life and preserving peace, but they spent their days planning battles and leading soldiers to their deaths. They meditated on the Force, but struggled to hear its voice over the screams of the dying and the thunder of artillery. "I had a dream last night," Kyle said, breaking the silence that had fallen between him and his former master. "I was back on the ice moon, back in the temple, but it was different. The crystals in the walls were cracking, darkening. The aurora overhead was red instead of blue and green. And Master Corrin was there, but he was warning me. He kept saying, 'The choice is coming, the choice is coming.' But he wouldn't tell me what choice, or when, or what it meant." Talia's expression grew grave. "Prophetic dreams are rare gifts and terrible burdens. My own master told me they're usually metaphorical, showing us truths in symbolic form rather than literal future events. But in times of great upheaval, when the Force itself is in flux, such dreams can be more direct." "You think it means something specific? Something I need to prepare for?" "I think it means you should trust your instincts," Talia said. "You've always had strong intuition, Kale. Even as a youngling, you could sense things others missed. That's why I chose you as my apprentice. Don't let the chaos of war dull that gift. Stay attuned to the Force, even when it's difficult, even when its guidance seems unclear." A chime sounded, and a hologram materialized in the air between them. It was an urgent summons from the Jedi Council, Master Windu requesting their presence for a briefing on a situation developing in the Outer Rim. Another battle, another mission, another chance to prove themselves as warriors in a war that seemed to have no end. Kyle and Talia exchanged glances, then headed toward the briefing room. The conversation about dreams and warnings faded into the background, replaced by the immediate demands of duty and service. But Kale couldn't quite shake the feeling that Master Corrin's warning meant something important, that somewhere in the galaxy, events were converging that would force him to make the choice the Force Spirit had spoken of. 3 months later, Kyle found himself on a frozen world in the Outer Rim territories. The planet was called Selvaris, a mining colony that had become strategically important due to its deposits of cortosis ore, a rare mineral that could short-circuit lightsaber blades. The Separatists had seized control of the planet, and the Republic needed it back. The battle had been brutal, clone troopers and battle droids clashing across ice fields that reminded Kale painfully of that winter night on Naboo, of the journey to the temple, of the simpler time when the Force had seemed like pure possibility rather than a tool for war. Now, standing in the ruins of the main mining facility, Kale surveyed the aftermath of victory. Hundreds of droids destroyed, dozens of clone troopers dead or wounded, the facility itself heavily damaged, its ability to produce cortosis compromised for months. They'd won technically, but the cost had been enormous, and the gain minimal. "Sir," one of the clone commanders approached, his armor scorched from plasma fire. "We've secured the facility. The droids are in full retreat." "Casualties?" Kyle asked, dreading the answer. 43 clones KIA, 67 wounded. We estimate over 300 droids destroyed." Numbers, statistics, lives reduced to reports and data. Kyle felt something twist in his chest, a wrongness that had been growing stronger with each battle, each campaign, each strategic victory purchased with blood and suffering. "See to the wounded," he instructed, "and prepare the facility for Republic occupation. I'll be in the command center reviewing our next objectives." The clone saluted and departed, leaving Kale alone among the wreckage. He closed his eyes and reached out through the Force, trying to find a peace that had always sustained him before the war. But all he felt was turmoil, conflict, the echoes of violence and death that permeated this place like radiation. His comm device chirped, a priority message from Coruscant. Kyle activated the hologram and found himself facing the blue-tinted image of Master Yoda, the ancient Jedi Grand Master, whose wisdom spanned centuries. "Kale Vreese," Yoda said, his voice raspy but strong. "A mission for you I have. Return to Coruscant you must. Speak with you privately I need to." "Of course, Master," Kyle responded, bowing slightly despite the fact that Yoda couldn't see the gesture through the hologram. "I'll depart immediately." "Good. Urgent this is. Come quickly." The hologram flickered and died. Kyle stood in the frozen ruins, trying to process this unexpected summons. Master Yoda rarely called individual Jedi for private meetings. Whatever this was about, it was important, perhaps even connected to the prophetic dream he'd had months earlier, the warning about a coming choice. He gathered his things and made his way to his starfighter, a modified Eta II Actus-class interceptor that had served him well throughout the war. As he settled into the cockpit and began pre-flight checks, he found his hand unconsciously moving to the medallion around its neck, the ice token that had never melted, never lost its connection to the temple on the ice moon. He squeezed it gently, and for just a moment, he felt what he always felt when he touched it. The presence of something vast and timeless, the echo of that night when he'd been 11 years old and the galaxy had seemed full of possibility rather than pain. The journey to Coruscant took 2 days through hyperspace. Kyle spent much of that time in meditation, trying to quiet his thoughts and open himself fully to the Force. But the visions that came were troubling. He saw shadows gathering around the Jedi Temple, saw familiar faces twisted with anger and betrayal, saw the temple itself burning, its ancient halls consumed by fire and darkness. Were these prophetic visions or merely his own anxieties given form? Kale couldn't tell. The line between genuine foresight and projection of one's own fears grew blurrier the more chaotic the galaxy became, the more the dark side gained strength. When he finally arrived at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, Kale was immediately struck by how different it felt from when he'd first seen it as a youngling. Then it had radiated peace and wisdom, a beacon of light in the urban sprawl of the galactic capital. Now it felt beleaguered, weary, like a fortress under siege, even though no enemy army stood at its gates. Master Yoda received him in the room of 1,000 fountains, the vast meditation garden at the heart of the temple. The ancient Jedi sat on a bench beside a reflecting pool, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and measured. Kyle approached quietly and knelt beside the pool, waiting for his elder to acknowledge his presence. "Troubled you are," Yoda said without opening his eyes. "Feel it, I do. The weight of war upon your spirit, heavy it has become." "Yes, Master," Kyle admitted. "I find it harder each day to reconcile what we do with what we're meant to be. We're supposed to be peacekeepers, but all I do is fight. We're supposed to preserve life, but I've led countless beings to their deaths. I'm losing sight of why we fight, of what we're trying to preserve." Yoda's eyes opened, and in them, Kale saw a sorrow that went bone deep, a pain that came from watching an order he'd served for 900 years lose its way. The right question, that is, what preserve do we? The Republic, the Jedi Order, our own lives, or something deeper, something that transcends all these things? The old master gestured for Kyle to sit beside him. "A story, I will tell you. Long ago, before even I was born, the Jedi faced another time of darkness. The Sith had risen, threatened to consume the galaxy. Many Jedi thought the only way to survive was to fight fire with fire, to embrace combat and warfare as our primary purpose." "What happened?" Kyle asked. "Lost our way, we did," Yoda said simply. "Became so focused on defeating the Sith that we forgot what we fought for. Forgot that the Force is not about victory or defeat, but about balance, understanding, connection. When finally the Sith were driven back, the Jedi who remained had to rebuild not just their order, but their understanding of what it meant to serve the Force." Yoda's gaze turned toward the reflecting pool, and in its surface, Kale could see the reflection of lights from the upper levels of the temple, thousands of tiny stars mirrored in still water. "Happening again, this is. Losing ourselves in war, we are becoming soldiers when we should remain guardians, and the Force itself grows dark in response, unbalanced by our actions." "What can we do?" Kyle asked. "The war won't end just because we recognize we're losing our way. The Separatists won't stop their attacks. Dooku and his allies won't suddenly embrace peace." "True, all of this is," Yoda acknowledged. "But change what we can. We must change ourselves. Change how we engage with the conflict. Remember that first, always Jedi we are. Warriors only when no other choice exists." The ancient master fixed Kyle with a penetrating stare. "Called you here, I did, for a reason specific. A mission you will undertake, but not a mission of war, a mission of remembrance." Yoda produced a small data crystal from his robes and held it out to Kale. "Records of the old Jedi temples this contains, sanctuaries built in ages past, places of meditation and communion with the Force. Lost, many of them are, forgotten in the rush of war. But needed now they are, needed more than ever." Kyle took the crystal, feeling its weight in his palm. "You want me to find these temples? In the middle of a war?" "Not find them all," Yoda clarified, "but one temple in particular, the Temple of Eternal Winter. Know of it, do you?" Kyle's heart stuttered. The medallion around his neck grew suddenly warm, responding to the mention of the place from which it had come. Yes, Master, I know of it. How do you—" "Many youngling have been called there over the centuries," Yoda said with a slight smile. Rare it is, but not unique. Those touched by the Force in special ways, they find their way to that place. Or it finds them. Test them, it does. Show them their potential, their possible futures. The old Jedi's expression grew more serious. But not in many years has any youngling reported being called there. Since the war began, the temple has gone silent. No ships appear, no children are taken on midnight journeys. Something wrong is, something changed. Kyle felt cold dread settling in his stomach. You think the temple has been damaged, compromised? No, not I do, Yoda admitted, but find out, you will. Go to the ice moon. Enter the temple. Learn what has changed and why. This mission, more important it may be than any battle you have fought. For if the temples fail, if the old places of power go dark, then lost forever the Jedi may be, no matter how many wars we win. I'll leave immediately, Kale said, rising to his feet. Wait, Yoda instructed. Alone, you should not go. Companion you need. Someone who understands what that place means, who shares your connection to it. Who? Kyle asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Another who was called there as a child. Another who carries a medallion like yours. Her name, Neela San it is. The name hit Kale like a physical blow. Neela, the Twi'lek girl who'd sat across the aisle from him on that ancient ship, who'd shared her fears and hopes with him during the journey. He hadn't seen her in 20 years, hadn't even known if she'd survived to adulthood, if she'd joined the Jedi Order or chosen a different path. She's here? Kyle asked. On Coruscant? Arriving tomorrow, she is, Yoda said. Summoned her as well, I did. Together, you will journey to the temple. Together, you will discover what has changed. And together, perhaps, you will find something the Jedi have lost, something we need desperately if survive this darkness we hope to. Kale bowed deeply. Thank you, Master, for trusting me with this. Trust you I do, Yoda confirmed, but trust the Force more. Listen to it. Let it guide you. And remember, young Vrees, that the choices we make define us more than the powers we possess. Choose wisely, you must. Choose with your heart, your mind, and the Force together. The meeting concluded, and Kale made his way to the quarters assigned to him in the temple. He spent the night in restless anticipation, memories of that winter night 20 years ago flooding back with startling clarity. He remembered Nyla's nervous Leku twitching as they'd talked on the ship, remembered her confession that her parents didn't believe in the Force, that she'd felt isolated and alone until finding others who shared her gift. What had become of that young girl? Had she joined the Order? Become a Jedi Knight like himself? Or had she chosen a different path, using her Force sensitivity in ways that didn't require formal training? The next day, Kyle waited in one of the temple's meditation gardens, watching the sky for incoming ships. When the transport finally landed, he felt his pulse quicken. The boarding ramp extended and a figure emerged. She was taller than he remembered, her green skin darker, more vibrant. Her Leku, which had been thin and nervous on that long-ago night, were now thick and decorated with traditional Twi'lek patterns. She wore the robes of a Jedi consular, and at her belt hung a lightsaber with a curved hilt, suggesting training in Makashi, the elegant dueling form. But it was her eyes that truly captured Kale's attention. They held the same mixture of wonder and determination he remembered from that child on the ship, but tempered now with experience, with hardship, endured, and overcome. Their gazes met across the landing platform, and recognition bloomed simultaneously in both their faces. Nyla's hand went immediately to something around her neck, hidden beneath her robes, and Cale knew without seeing that she touched a medallion identical to his own. "Cale," she called out, her voice uncertain despite the obvious recognition. "Nyla," he confirmed, moving toward her. "I can't believe, after all these years." They met in the middle of the landing platform, and without conscious decision, both reached for their medallions, pulling them out to show each other. The ice tokens clinked gently as they brought them close together, and both artifacts flared with sudden warmth, responding to their proximity. "You kept it," Nyla said, wonder in her voice. "All this time." "Never took it off," Kyle admitted. "You?" "Same. It's been my anchor, through youngling training, through the trials, through the war. Whenever I felt lost, I'd touch it and remember that night. Remember the temple, the visions, the sense that I was part of something larger than myself." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 2 decades and countless experiences hanging between them. Finally, Nyla spoke again. "Master Yoda told me why he summoned us both. The temple is in trouble. We're being sent to investigate." "We're being sent home," Kyle corrected gently, "back to the place where we first understood what we could become. It's fitting, in a way. The galaxy is falling apart, the Jedi are losing their way, and we're being sent back to the beginning, back to the source." "Do you think we can help?" Nyla asked. "If something has corrupted the temple, if the Force itself is damaged there, what can 2 Jedi Knights do about it?" "I don't know," Kyle admitted, "but I trust Master Yoda, and I trust the Force. If we've been called to do this, there's a reason. We just need to find out what it is." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey. Cale requisitioned a small transport vessel, one with enough range to reach the Ice Moon's remote coordinates. Neela gathered supplies and equipment, medical kits and survival gear in case they needed to spend extended time in the temple's harsh environment. As they worked, they talked, sharing stories of the past 20 years. Neela had indeed joined the Jedi Order, recruited from Ryloth when she demonstrated her Force abilities to a passing Jedi Master. Her training had focused on healing and diplomacy rather than combat, though the war had forced her to learn lightsaber technique out of necessity. "I spent 5 years on Ilum," she told Cale as they loaded supplies into the transport. "Working with younglings as they went through their gathering trials, helping them connect with their kyber crystals. It was beautiful work, meaningful. But when the war started, they pulled almost all of us back to Coruscant. Now, I serve in field hospitals, mending clone troopers who've been torn apart by battle droids." "It's not what we thought it would be," Kyle said quietly, "being a Jedi. When we were children on that ship, we imagined we'd be peacekeepers, diplomats, maybe adventurers exploring the galaxy and helping those in need. Instead, we became soldiers," Nyla finished. "Generals and warriors and participants in a conflict that seems to corrupt everything it touches." They fell silent, the truth of their shared disillusionment hanging heavy between them. But there was comfort in it, too, in finding someone who understood, who'd walked a similar path and reached similar conclusions. The journey to the Ice Moon took 3 days through hyperspace. During that time, Kale and Nyla fell into an easy companionship that felt both new and ancient, as if they'd known each other for years, despite spending most of their lives apart. They meditated together, practiced lightsaber forms in the transport's small cargo hold, and talked late into the ship's artificial night about everything they'd seen and done and feared. "I've been having dreams," Nyla confessed on the second night as they sat in the transport's common area drinking synthesized tea. "About the temple. In them, I see it corrupted, twisted. The ice has turned black, and the aurora overhead burns red like fire, and there are figures moving through the halls, but I can't see their faces. They feel wrong, dark, like they don't belong there." "I've had similar dreams," Kyle admitted. "Master Corrin appears in mine, the Force spirit who guided me when I was there as a child. He keeps warning me that a choice is coming, but he won't say what choice or when." "Do you think the dreams are prophetic?" Neela asked, "or just our fears about what we might find?" "Maybe both," Kyle suggested. "The Force shows us what we need to see, but it doesn't always distinguish between literal future events and symbolic warnings. Whatever we find when we arrive, I don't think it will be what we're expecting." On the third day, they emerged from hyperspace in the system containing the ice moon. Kyle felt his breath catch as the moon came into view on the transport's forward screens. It looked exactly as he remembered. Ice and snow covering every surface, mountains carved from frozen water, vast plains of pristine white stretching to curved horizons. But something was different. The aurora was absent. Where vibrant curtains of color should have danced across the moon's atmosphere, there was only darkness. The sky above the moon was as black and empty as the void of space itself. No trace of the force-made visible phenomenon that had defined this place. "The aurora is gone," Neela whispered, her leku twitching with distress. "How is that possible? The aurora was the force itself. It can't just disappear." "Nothing is impossible," Kyle said grimly, beginning their descent toward the moon's surface. "But it's definitely not a good sign." They landed on the same plateau where the ancient ship had deposited Kale 20 years earlier. The temperature outside read -60 degrees Celsius, well below what should have been survivable without environmental suits. But when they opened the transport's hatch and stepped out onto the frozen surface, they found the air no colder than a winter's day on Naboo. "The temple is still protecting the area," Neela observed, "maintaining an environment where life can exist. That's something, at least." They trekked across the snow toward the temple, following the path Kale remembered from his childhood. As they approached, details became visible that filled both of them with growing dread. The ice walls that had once gleamed with inner light were now dull, almost opaque. The carvings that had seemed to move with captured life were still, frozen in place like insects in amber. The entrance archway still stood, but the light that had pulsed within it was gone. They stepped through into absolute darkness. Kyle ignited his lightsaber, and the blue blade cast dancing shadows across walls of dead ice. Beside him, Nyla activated her own weapon, a green blade that hummed in harmony with his. Together, they advanced into the temple, their lights revealing a scene of devastation. The antechamber where Varen had greeted them, where they'd learned about the temple's history and purpose, was in ruins. The floor patterns were shattered, great cracks running through the ice like wounds. Chunks of ceiling had fallen, creating obstacles they had to navigate around, and everywhere there was darkness, not just the absence of light, but presence of shadow, thick and cloying and wrong. "Something terrible happened here," Neela said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it in the force. Violence, corruption. A battle was fought in this place." But against what? Kale wondered. Who would attack a temple dedicated to understanding the Force? And more importantly, where is Varen? Where are the Guardians? They pressed deeper into the temple, following corridors that Kale remembered leading to the crystal chambers. But the paths had changed. Where once there had been clear routes illuminated by gentle light, now there were collapsed passages and dead ends, as if the temple itself had been wounded and was struggling to maintain its structure. Finally, they reached what Kale believed was the chamber where he'd met Master Corrin. But it was almost unrecognizable. The thousands of kyber crystals that had adorned the walls were gone, either removed or destroyed. The platform where he'd stood and received his visions was cracked down the middle, and the aurora visible through the open ceiling was absent, replaced by an empty black sky that seemed to press down on them with physical weight. "This is wrong," Kyle said, horror creeping into his voice. "This is all wrong. The crystals should be here. The force should be thick in the air. Instead, it's like a void. Like the force itself has been drained from this place." "Not drained," a voice echoed from the shadows. "Stolen." Both Jedi spun, lightsabers raised in defensive positions. From the darkness at the edge of the chamber stepped a figure, and Kale's heart nearly stopped when he recognized them. Varen, the conductor who had guided him and so many other children to this place, but changed, corrupted. The ethereal beauty that had defined them was gone, replaced by something twisted and dark. Their robes were tattered, their skin marked with what looked like burns or scars, and their amber eyes now glowed with a sickly yellow light. "Varen?" Nyla gasped. "What happened to you?" "What happened?" Varen laughed, and the sound was bitter, broken. "I remained faithful. I served the Force. I protected this temple for 4,000 years. And when darkness came, when the Sith Lords arrived seeking the crystal's power, I fought them, alone, unaided, because the great Jedi Order was too busy with their war to protect the sacred places they'd sworn to guard." Kyle felt shame burn in his chest. "Sith Lords came here? When?" "6 months ago," Varen said. "They'd learned of this place through ancient records, discovered that the kyber crystals here were unique, infused with pure force energy that could be corrupted and turned to dark purposes. They came with armies, with weapons designed to drain the force itself. And I fought them. For weeks, I held them back. But I was alone, and they were many." The corrupted conductor gestured around the ruined chamber. "They took the crystals, stole them to power some terrible weapon they're building, and in taking them, they wounded the Force itself in this place. The Aurora died because the connection between this temple and the greater cosmic force was severed. The medallions you carry, the tokens given to children over the centuries, they're the only fragments of this temple's original power that remain." Nayla stepped forward, her weapon still raised, but her voice gentle. "Varen, we're sorry. We didn't know. If you had known, what would you have done?" Varen demanded. You serve the council, you follow their orders, and they ordered you to fight their war, to defend the Republic, while the true treasures of the Force were left vulnerable to those who would corrupt them. The conductor's form began to shift, shadows gathering around them like smoke. I tried to preserve what remained, tried to hold the temple together, but the darkness they left behind was too strong. It infected me, corrupted me. I am no longer the guide I once was. I am something else now, something that exists between light and dark, unable to fully be either. Kyle felt his hand move to the medallion around his neck. The ice token was warm against his skin, pulsing with what felt like recognition or maybe sympathy. An idea began to form, desperate but possible. "The medallions," he said slowly. "You said they contained fragments of the temple's original power. What if we returned them? What if we gave them back, added their energy to what remains here? Would it be enough to heal this place?" Varen's glowing eyes fixed on him, and for a moment the corruption faded slightly, revealing a glimpse of the being they had once been. "It might," they admitted. "The medallions were crafted from the temple's ice, infused with its essence. They're pieces of this place, scattered across the galaxy in the hands of those who were called here. If enough were returned, if enough of that power was concentrated in one place again, the temple might recover. The connection to the Force might be restored." "How many?" Nyla asked. "How many medallions would it take?" "All of them," Varen said. "Every token given over 4 millennia. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Some belonging to Jedi who are long dead. Others carried by beings who may have left the Order or never joined it at all. Finding them would take years, decades." "Or," Kyle said, the idea crystallizing in his mind, "we start with what we have. We give our medallions now, begin the healing, and trust that others will follow. The Force connects all who were called to this place. If we return our tokens, they'll feel it. They'll know the temple needs them, and they'll come." It was audacious. It required a level of faith that Kale wasn't sure he possessed. But as he looked around at the ruined chamber, at the corrupted conductor, at the empty sky where the aurora should have been dancing, he knew it was the only choice that made sense. The choice Master Corrin had warned him about. Not a choice between light and dark, not a decision about which side to fight for in the war, but a choice about what he valued most, what he was willing to sacrifice to preserve something that mattered more than his own comfort or certainty. Nyla met his eyes, and he saw his own resolve reflected back at him. Without words, they both reached up and removed the medallions from around their necks. For 20 years, these tokens had been their connection to the moment that had defined them, the night that had shown them their potential and purpose. Giving them up felt like giving away a piece of their souls, but it was necessary, it was right. Together, they approached the center of the chamber where the cracked platform stood. They placed their medallions on the ice side by side and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. The medallions sat there, small and insignificant, 2 tiny tokens trying to heal a wound that encompassed an entire moon. Then they began to glow, soft at first, barely visible, but growing brighter with each passing second. Blue light radiated from the ice, spreading across the platform, flowing into the cracks and beginning to knit them together. The light intensified, became brilliant, almost blinding in its purity, and then impossibly, wonderfully, the aurora began to return. High above, through the open ceiling, curtains of color started to materialize. Faint at first, like memories of what had been, but strengthening, growing more solid and vivid with each heartbeat. Green and blue and purple, dancing across the black sky, reclaiming territory from the darkness. Kale felt it through the forest. The temple was waking up. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to begin healing. Enough to send out a call to all who had ever received its gifts, summoning them home. Across the galaxy, in meditation chambers and starship cockpits, in battle zones and peaceful gardens, beings who had once journeyed to the temple of eternal winter would feel a pull, a warmth against their chests where medallions hung, a whisper in their minds, gentle but insistent. The temple needed them. The temple called them home. And in the ruined chamber, Varen began to change. The corruption that had twisted them started to recede, not disappearing, but becoming more manageable, more contained. The sickly yellow glow in their eyes faded, revealing amber once more. "You did it," the conductor whispered, wonder in the voice. "You gave up where you treasured most, not knowing if it would be enough." That's what the Force requires sometimes. Not power or knowledge or even sacrifice exactly, but trust, absolute faith that if we do what's right, the Force will provide what's needed. Kael and Nyla stood together, watching as the temple slowly came back to life around them. It would take time, years, perhaps decades, for the temple to fully recover, but it would recover. And when it did, it would once again serve as a beacon for Force-sensitive children across the galaxy, a place where they could discover their potential and make the choices that would define their futures. "What happens now?" Nyla asked quietly. "Now we go back to Coruscant," Kyle said. "We report to Master Yoda. We continue our service in this war that we didn't choose but can't ignore. But we do it differently, with the understanding that the war isn't the most important thing. The temples are the most important thing. The old places of power, the connections to the Force itself, those are what we're really fighting for. The war will end eventually," Nyla added, "but the Force is eternal. If we lose the temples, if we let the sacred places fall into darkness, we lose something that can never be replaced." Varen approached them, moving with some of their old grace restored. "I have a gift for you," the conductor said. "Since you gave yours so freely, it's only right you receive something in return." The being produced two objects from within their tattered robes. They were crystals, each the size of a thumb, glowing with soft inner light. One was blue, the other green, matching the colors of Kale and Nyla's lightsabers. "These are the last uncorrupted crystals from this chamber," Varen explained. "Keep them, not as replacements for what you gave, but as reminders. When the war ends, when peace returns, come back here. Help rebuild what was lost. Train the next generation of younglings. Teach them what you've learned. Pass on the wisdom you've gained through struggle and doubt and eventual understanding." They accepted the crystals, feeling their weight, their power, their promise. These weren't just kyber fragments. They were commitments to the future, obligations to ensure that what had been nearly lost would be preserved and strengthened for those who came after. As Kale and Nayla prepared to leave the temple, they turned back one last time to see Varen standing on the platform, arms raised toward the aurora that now danced overhead with growing strength. The conductor was chanting in a language Kale didn't recognize, words that seemed to resonate with the Force itself, calling to all who had ever walked these halls. The journey back to their transport was made in contemplative silence. The temple corridors were already beginning to repair themselves, ice flowing like water to fill cracks and restore pathways. By the time they reached the entrance, the archway was glowing again, pulsing with welcome rather than warning. Aboard their ship, as they prepared for the journey back to Coruscant, Kyle found himself thinking about Master Corran's warning, "The choice is coming." He'd thought it meant some dramatic decision between light and dark, some pivotal moment where he'd have to choose between obvious good and obvious evil. Instead, it had been much simpler and much harder. The choice to let go of something precious in faith that it would return multiplied. The choice to trust the Force rather than his own understanding. The choice to remember that being a Jedi wasn't about the battles you won or the wars you fought, but about the connections you preserved and the hope you maintained even in the darkest times. "Do you think they'll come?" Nyla asked as they entered hyperspace, the ice moon falling away behind them. "The others who were called to the temple, do you think they'll feel the summons and return their medallions?" "I think some will," Coyle said. "Not all. Some of the tokens belong to beings who are dead. Others were lost or destroyed over the centuries, but enough will return. Enough will answer the call. The Force will see to that." He looked at the green crystal Varen had given Nyla, at the blue one he now carried. "And when the war ends, when peace returns, we'll go back. We'll help rebuild. We'll ensure that future generations have what we had. That chance to discover their potential in a place where the Force itself is visible and tangible." "When the war ends," Neela repeated. "Do you really think it will? Sometimes it feels like it will go on forever." "All wars end," Kale said with more certainty than he felt. "The question is what remains when they do. Whether we've preserved the things worth fighting for or sacrificed them in the pursuit of victory." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the ship carried them back toward Coruscant, toward their duties and obligations, toward the war that consumed the galaxy. But they were changed by what they'd done, by the choice they'd made, by the trust they'd placed in the Force. Above the ice moon of Hoth's northern pole, the aurora danced with growing brilliance. And across the galaxy, beings who had thought their medallions were merely nostalgic tokens felt them warm against their skin. Some would ignore the sensation, others would wonder at it, but do nothing. But some would remember, would recall a childhood journey to an impossible temple, would feel the Force calling them home. And one by one, across months and years, they would make their own choices. They would return what they'd been given, adding their light to the growing restoration, becoming part of something larger than any individual, any war, any single moment in time. The temple of eternal winter would heal. The Force would flow again, and children not yet born would one day board a mysterious ship on winter nights, would journey to a place between myth and reality, would discover their potential and make the choices that would define not just their own futures, but the future of the galaxy itself. That was the true meaning of the Force. Not power or knowledge or even victory, but connection, preservation, the patient work of maintaining light in darkness, of nurturing hope when despair seemed easier, of trusting that if you did what was right, the Force would provide what was needed. Kyle and Neela had learned that lesson. They would carry it with them through the war and beyond. And when their time came to guide the next generation, they would pass it on, ensuring that the wisdom gained in that crystal chamber on a frozen moon would echo through the ages, a gift given freely and returned multiplied, forever and always. If you enjoyed this journey to the Temple of Eternal Winter and want to explore more Star Wars lore, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support helps create more comprehensive deep dives into the rich history of the galaxy far, far away. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What Force vision would you want to see if you visited the temple? Which era of Jedi history fascinates you most? And what other Star Wars topics should we explore in future videos? May the Force be with you always. And may your dreams be filled with the dancing light of distant auroras and the promise of potential waiting to be realized.